This is Criminal Behaviorology, the combination of criminology and behavior analysis to assist the criminal justice and civil justice systems and to improve our society in general. Check us out on Podomatic.com or Anchor.fm for this podcast, as well as our Facebook page and our Blogger account.
My name is Darius McCollum. Over the years, I have operated trains in the New York City subway system, Metro North, New Jersey Transit, and yet I have never been an employee of any of these agencies.
Well, a Manhattan man is getting a free ride to prison.
And McCollum said to have an encyclopedic knowledge of all things transit-related.
All of his crimes were victimless. He would safely make all of the stops, make the announcements.
He says, I'm volunteering my time, as if he's a high schooler getting community service hours.
Now, he's been picked up 20 times for the same thing.
McCollum claims to have commandeered more than 100 buses for joyrides over the past 30 years.
McCollum has such a lengthy rap sheet of transit-related crimes, he has his own Wikipedia page.
Because I have Asperger's syndrome, I have trouble making friends. I didn't want to be bullied. I didn't want to be picked on. I didn't want to have to be beaten up.
When he was young, when he was assaulted, he lost that sense of value as to who he is. Wearing a uniform creates a sense of value for Darius.
It was like I was married to the MTA.
He can't help it. My son, he doesn't belong there because he doesn't hurt anybody.
While he was in jail, he never got any therapy.
There's a possibility that I can definitely die in jail.
He has been stuck in this revolving door for his whole entire life.
And what you just heard there was the trailer for the 2016 film Off the Rails, the story of Darius McCollum. This is a 2016 documentary, and the filmmaker director is Mr. Adam Irving. And if I actually hear on a YouTube video where I got the trailer, it says Darius McCollum has a love of transport that has led him to being jailed 32 times, spending 23 years in prison despite never harming any person or property, suffering from Asperger's syndrome over 3 decades. Darius has commandeered New York buses and subway trains only to correctly drive their routes and announce the stops. A remarkable story of society's failure to channel the harmless passions of a mentally challenged man into a productive life. And there's actually been, I've seen several television specials about the Darius McCollum case, and also some different newspaper and web articles about this same case that you may be able to find. Recently, I attended the Association for Behavior Analysis International's annual Autism Conference that took place on the January 18th, 19th, and 20th in San Francisco, California. I presented a poster on there about autism and crime in honor of the issue, cases like this, and also gave some information out about the podcast Criminal Behaviorology that you're listening to right now. I noticed that there was a lot of interest in the Darius McCollum case, and I got in contact with the filmmaker, Mr. Irving, and we went ahead and had an interview, and I'm going to play that for you in just a little bit. If you look on the podcast, on the show notes, we're going to have a link to Mr. Irving's movie and then some other information about the Darius McCollum case. As we'll talk about, I think this is a good example of perhaps where the criminal justice system isn't quite up to date with the modern understanding of mental health conditions and problems that people may have. It's very old ideas about you get caught, you pay a price, which in many cases is completely appropriate. But is it as simple as that in every case? And I think that's what the Darius McCollum case illustrates. So go ahead and have a listen here to my interview with Adam Irving. And if you have any feedback, go ahead and give us a review on iTunes or any of the podcasts that this comes across, or go on the Facebook page or the blogger page, or send us an email, criminalbehaviorology@gmail.com, and let us know what you think. Adam, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well.
Now, you are a film producer?
Yes, I generally just call myself a filmmaker because I'm the director as well. I've never really produced a film without also shooting it and editing it and doing all that.
Mm-hmm. And what got you into this particular line of work?
It started when I was a teenager. I just became fascinated by movies, and I got a job at my local independent video store and watched a lot of movies, and then majored in film in college and then grad school. And I actually wanted to be a film history professor, but that didn't work out. I left my PhD program and moved to Hollywood to be a filmmaker, and that just felt like a better fit than studying and teaching film. I thought, why don't I make these movies that I've been learning about for so many years? And so here I am.
Right, you find are you learning more this way, you think, than you would have in academia?
Well, in academia, I was studying theory, history, and criticism. We never actually learned how to make movies. We just learned how to analyze them.
Right.
So now that I'm making them, I'm certainly learning way more about filmmaking than I did when I was in school. But I've ceased my academic study of film a long time ago, so I've forgotten about a lot of the old classic films that I studied and the old directors and a lot of the history because I've been so focused on, learning the equipment and actual storytelling and budgeting and things like that.
Mm-hmm. What's the hardest part of being a director and a filmmaker?
For me, it's actually depending on other people.
Mm-hmm.
See, if I was just a photographer or a painter, I could envision something and then execute it. But if you want to be, let's say, an architect or a film director, you need to hire dozens and sometimes hundreds of people to help you execute your vision. And at the end of the day, when someone's working for you and it's not their baby, it's not their movie, they never really care as much as you do. So you're always trying to, inspire and, encourage people to work a little harder and give you a little bit more. And it's sometimes hard to get that from people who are late or unreliable because they're working on 10 other films. So I wish I had like 100 more of me so I could do everything my way. But in the meantime, I just have to, make teamwork work for me.
So you're kind of the captain of the ship, so to speak,
yes,
when it comes to filmmaking.
Yeah.
Why did you become interested in a film on this subject matter, on the life of Darius McCollum?
Well, the story of Darius McCollum really fascinated me because, first of all, it's a story of an imposter. And I'm really interested in people who can get up every day and pretend to be someone they're not. Especially if they're not hurting anyone or damaging any property. It just amazes me that people can live a lie their whole lives. And that's who Darius McCollum was and is. Mm-hmm. Secondly, Darius's story is a very New York story. A lot of people in New York have heard of Darius McCollum. They know of him as this famous subway driver imposter who's been arrested many times for the same bizarre crime. And I used to live in New York, and I used to take the subway every day.
Mm-hmm.
So when I learned about Darius, that there was this guy who was driving hundreds of buses and subway trains, as an imposter, I thought maybe he drove my subway train, one of those days. And lastly, I guess I just am drawn to crime stories. They're really hot right now with documentaries, and it's not just about an imposter, but about a guy who keeps going through the criminal justice system and dealing with judges and lawyers and courts, and that whole world is just really interesting to me because your life is at stake, your freedom, when you go to jail and you commit a crime.
Yeah, I lived in New York in 98 and 99, so do you think I could have ridden on one of the subways Darius was commanding?
Yeah, it's quite likely, because up until 9/11, most of Darius's crimes focused on driving subway trains, especially in the 90s. After 9/11, when security got tighter, he transitioned into buses.
Oh, okay.
That became his specialty, yeah.
Okay, so it starts out with Darius and his first arrest for absconding with either a probably then was a subway. What age was he, or about what year was this?
Well, the first time Darius was actually caught driving a subway train was in 1981, when he was about 15. And it got in the New York Times. It was on television, and it was a really big deal that this young kid commandeered a subway train, and more importantly, he made all of the stops and the announcements and kept the train on schedule for 8 stops until he was caught by the police. So it's kind of funny because, his mother was so upset that her son, got arrested and was in the newspaper, but she was also proud of him that he did such a good job driving the train, even though he stole it.
So he did a stellar job as a train operator.
Yes, and has ever since.
Yeah. And what is it about, what is known about his life that led him to this? He's been diagnosed with Asperger's disorder, or we'll say Autism Spectrum Disorder. Is that right?
Yes, he actually wasn't diagnosed until his 30s, because when he was a kid in the 70s and 80s, little was known about autism and Asperger's, and so they didn't really have a name for what Darius had, so they just said, oh, the kid's got behavioral problems, or he's a little professor that knows all these useless facts and things like that. So Darius, by being on the spectrum, has a very good memory for statistics and maps and charts and schedules, and he's fascinated by things that are repetitive and predictable. So he likes trains a lot more than cars, for example, because cars can get stuck in traffic, they can veer off the road, they don't run on a schedule, they're driven by individuals who do whatever they want. But trains, they only go forward or back, and they're on a track and they're on a schedule, so they're predictable. And the routes that they take are always the same. They can be memorized. So I think Darius was really drawn to the way he could organize and memorize all of this information on the New York City transit system. And he wanted to master it. That's what made him feel good about himself. But also to provide a service to the public by driving the trains and the buses and getting people from point A to point B in a safe and timely fashion.
Was that part of his motive, to basically to help people?
Yeah, he sees himself as a public servant who doesn't get paid. And I think because he's never really had many friends, the public sort of became his friends. The idea that he's helping people made him feel good, because otherwise he'd just be alone and wouldn't really have any human interaction.
Did he have any traumatic experiences in his life that may have led to this behavior or this fixation with him?
Yes. When Darius was, I think around 11 or so, he was in school, this was in the 70s, in one of New York's worst snowstorms on record. And only one other kid in his class made it to school because of the poor weather. The buses weren't running. And this kid and Darius were both given puzzles to do by the teacher to keep busy. And the other kid finished his puzzle and tried to take Darius's puzzle that Darius was still working on, and Darius wouldn't give it to him. So the kid took a pair of scissors and stabbed Darius in the back, and it almost killed him. It resulted in a collapsed lung, and Darius went to the hospital and was in a coma. And so pretty much for the rest of his life, since that moment, he is afraid of having people walk behind him when he's sitting in a chair because he's afraid he's going to be stabbed. So he likes to always make sure people are in front of him. And because of that, he was afraid to go back to school because he was afraid he'd get bullied again or stabbed again. So he started skipping class and going to the place where he felt safe, which of course was underground in the subway. And that's where he made friends with all of the subway workers who were adults who he could trust that weren't going to bully him or stab him, unlike the kids at school that he was hiding from. So that's really where his life changed, from being a regular student to this person obsessed with subways and going there for all of his socializing because he wasn't going to school anymore.
So this case has some aspects of maybe post-traumatic stress disorder, that kind of thing, that was a factor in Darius's life.
Yeah, it was definitely like a trigger incident that led to trauma and really avoiding having a normal life because of what happened to him.
For behavior analysts, we might say that this was partially, we'll say, escape maintained, and escape of the traumatic situations that he was going through. So that led him into the driver's seat of a subway car, and then
yes, absolutely.
And then another motive was it does seem to help people, and then to have this intricate knowledge, make use of this intricate knowledge of the train system.
Correct.
Is it true that he's had how many arrests total, would you say?
Darius has had, I believe, 32 arrests since he was a teenager, and those are just the times where he's been caught driving trains and buses illegally. He claims to have taken over 500 trains and buses for joyrides and various things like that. So in total, for these 32 arrests, Darius has spent over 20 years total in maximum security prison and in various local jails in New York City, while he's been awaiting trial at various times.
So why couldn't the police and the subway authorities, the MTA, why couldn't they stop him from doing these things?
Well, they could. They did stop him 32 times, but they couldn't catch him the other times because Darius is a master of disguise and manipulation. He talks the talk and he walks the walk. So if you were an MTA worker, like a subway driver in New York, and Darius was working with you, you wouldn't know that he was an imposter because he would get uniforms. He would make the uniforms, he would get the keys, he would get fake IDs that said he worked for the transit system, and he had memorized all 468 subway stations and schedules and routes, so you would never suspect that there was anything fishy about him because he acted like the guys who actually worked for the transit authority. So that's the main way he got away with it, is that he didn't come off as someone who wasn't supposed to be there.
Did they actually have warning posters up, or look out for this guy, he might try and get in control of the train, things like that?
Yeah, those are called BOLOS. BOLO stands for Be on the Lookout, and they would place these BOLO posters in staff areas. So if you were on the subway, you would never see these posters. They were only posted in the locker rooms for the transit workers.
Right.
And so, there were many workers that noticed these posters and memorized Darius's face. But, it was like a low-resolution picture, and maybe the posters would only be up for a few days or a few weeks, and then they'd be taken down, and there'd be new workers who hadn't seen the posters, who didn't know who Darius was. But he also, he wore disguises, he would put on weight, he would lose weight. So even if you had seen the BOLO poster, if a few months passed, you might not recognize Darius if he looked different, or, like I said, if the employee was new or something like that. So the other thing is, there were employees who did know who he was, but they liked him. And they didn't report him because he would do their jobs for them for free. So imagine you're a New York City bus driver and you see Darius in the bus depot, and instead of telling on him, you go to Darius and you say, "Hey, Darius, do you want to drive my bus?" And he'd say, "Of course, I'd love to." So Darius would drive the bus route, and the guy who was supposed to be driving would go home and, spend the day with his wife and get paid for a day of work that Darius was doing for him for free.
In a sense, they exploited him.
Yeah, you could say that they did, because he did their work, and when he got caught, he would go to jail, and those people who gave up their buses or their trains to him, they never got in trouble, because Darius made a point of never saying who gave him the keys or who gave him the ID or who gave him the bus.
They got paid, and then he got in trouble.
Exactly.
Is it accurate that he helped or he was somehow involved in negotiating a union contract or part of the negotiation phase for the union?
Yeah, there's a nice little scene in the documentary I made about Darius, showing how Darius took his obsession so far that instead of just driving the trains and the buses in the New York transit system, he actually lobbied for the employees to get better working conditions and higher pay during a famous strike. I think it was in the early 90s. And this is a guy, Darius, who never even worked for the MTA, and yet he marched and went on strike with the workers, and they even asked him to be the head of the union because he was so passionate, and he had to tell these guys secretly that he didn't even work for the MTA, let alone could he be a union leader. And they were so blown away by that because he was the most passionate and knowledgeable of all the subway workers, and yet wasn't even part of the transit system. So that was, for me, a really funny moment because it showed how far he was willing to take his dedication of being a good Samaritan.
It sounds like Darius is the best non-paid supporter of the MTA they've ever had.
Yeah, absolutely. And the irony is that the MTA hates Darius because even though he's driven their trains and buses for free, the higher ups at the transit authority are so afraid, one, that one day he's going to crash a bus or a train, and because he's not insured, could cause a huge disaster. And secondly, Darius has made the MTA look really bad because he's proven how easy it is to steal a bus or a train and get away with it.
I think that's one of the most surprising things of the story. That people just assume, there's not going to be anyone in there that doesn't belong, and yet he's able to do this with such stealth, time and time again. And also apparently with some help from the inside, that really surprises people, especially in consideration that Darius has a condition. He's on the spectrum. That someone's able to do this is maybe one of the most surprising aspects of the story.
It is very surprising to most people because they assume that there's all of these security checks in place. But one that I was surprised by, that Darius demonstrates even in my film, is that New York City buses don't have a key. They don't require a key to start. So if you see a bus running, or not even running, just pulled over on the street and the doors are open, anyone can just walk right in, sit in the driver's seat, press the start button, and drive away. There's no fancy manual gear shift or anything. It's just a regular automatic transmission. In theory, anyone could just go into a bus, start it up, and drive it away, and at least get away with it until the GPS tracker reveals where the bus is.
What kind of criminal sanctions has Darius been facing? I mean, at one point he was facing a great deal of time. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I don't know if they still have it, but a lot of states, have a 3-strike rule.
Right.
And Darius was well beyond his 3rd strike.
Yeah.
So he was looking at life in prison, which is, 20, 25 years, something like that, for, a fairly minor crime. Well, I can't remember exactly what he did the last time, but that would have really been the end of his life, because he's now well into his 50s and not in the best of health, given that he's been on a prison diet for the last 3 decades, and with little exercise. So luckily he hasn't been given a life sentence yet, because every time he's facing that sentence, he makes a plea deal with the prosecutor to essentially say, look, I know what I did. I'm not embarrassed. I'm happy to admit it and plead guilty if you reduce my sentence from life to, let's say, 3 years or 5 years, which of course is still a long time, but a lot less than, spending the rest of his life behind bars.
Yeah, a common 3 strikes you're out or habitual felon charge would be 3 separate felonies, and stealing 3 separate subway trains or buses could count as 3 separate felonies.
Yeah, I think they would.
And they've even had cases where people have written 3 separate bad checks and have been under threat of receiving a habitual offender charge or a 3 strikes or out charge. So yeah, and the only thing the defendant can do is try and get it pled down to a lighter sentence.
Yeah.
So where is Dariuss currently?
Well, right now, Darius is in a place he's never been before, which is a little bit exciting, because instead of being sentenced to a correctional facility, a couple months ago, a judge sentenced him to a locked mental health facility. So right now, Darius is in Rochester, New York, at a mental institution that is locked. So it's essentially like a prison in that the residents aren't allowed to leave, but it is not an actual prison. So Darius is actually given, mental health treatment. And this is the first time in his life that he's been sentenced to a mental health facility instead of a correctional facility. So that sentencing represents a lot of progress for the New York State correctional system, that they're finally seeing that just locking people up doesn't really help if the core of the cause of the crime is a mental health issue and not a criminal issue. So Darius calls me every week from this facility, and he tells me that it's all right, it's better than prison, but there's one big problem. At this particular facility, it's up to the doctors there when Darius will be released. In other words, once he's quote unquote cured, then they can release him into the general population. But because there is no cure for Asperger's, they could keep him there forever. Whereas at least if he was in a state prison, as bad as it is being in a state prison, they would eventually have to let him out based on his, let's say, 5-year sentence. So there are some pluses and minuses to him being at this mental health facility versus a correctional facility.
Do they have to show that, and I know how some of this stuff works, but do they have to show that he could be a danger to himself or others in the condition that he is in order to keep him at such a facility?
I don't know if they have to continually demonstrate that, but I think that essentially Darius has to prove that he's changed, that he's less of a threat. And I know that his lawyer really fought to prove that he was not a dangerous person, mainly because he has never hurt anyone or damaged any property. But the prosecutor was able to prove, using various stories about Darius, that although he's not directly a violent person, he does represent a threat to society in the broader sense, because he's not formally trained or insured, and he's driving public vehicles with dozens of people on them who could be killed. It's just that he hasn't done anything dangerous yet, but that doesn't mean he won't have an accident or slip up, in the future. So I can see their point. He is in a sense a threat to society because he does not obey the rules. He does not respect the law, and he's got people's lives in his hand when he's driving a subway train in rush hour with 2,000 people on it.
Do you think this case has raised questions about our basic criminal justice system of, you get caught, you get punished, you pay your debt to society either as a stay in prison or maybe probation or parole or something like that, or perhaps you will be found insane. You'll be found like the basic standard is you just, because of mental illness, you just simply could not control your behavior. But Dariuss doesn't seem to fit the mold for either of those two areas. If I'm kind of making sense here about Dariuss's particular case?
Yeah, I once heard someone put it this way, that Dariuss is not quote-unquote crazy enough to be put in the loony bin, because he is a fairly sensible person. He does understand that what he's doing is wrong. He has never hurt anyone. He doesn't, hear voices or talk to himself or do anything that would present as having severe mental illness. And yet, he's not sane enough to be treated like a regular criminal who knows the difference between right and wrong, because no sane, mentally healthy person would commit the same crime 32 times in a row knowing what the consequences were. So there's clearly something wrong with Dariuss emotionally that needs therapeutic treatment, and incarceration is not going to solve it, because they just warehouse you in a cage essentially and feed you, and then when you get out, you're just as likely as before to commit the same crime again, because you actually haven't been rehabilitated. You've just been punished. So punishment works on people who, perhaps really are evil and understand what they're doing is wrong and just need that strong deterrent. But Dariuss is not deterred by prison partially because he thrives on the routine of it, because of his Asperger's.
It's no matter how much they punished him, it wouldn't matter, and these concepts of criminal justice, it goes back centuries. But now that we know about conditions like Asperger's or autism spectrum or other things, it seems to bring up new questions with a case like this of how we'll successfully rehabilitate people, and then what the rehabilitation would actually be, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think it's a good case that demonstrates the current limitations of the criminal justice system, and that, as you said earlier, not everyone fits in that mold of you do the crime, you do the time, and then everything's okay.
What kind of reaction have you gotten to this? It came out in 2016. It's been a pretty popular film. It's been an award-winning film.
Yes, it's done especially well with critics and reviews. It has a 100% score on Rotten Tomatoes, which is the highest in the world. It was a New York Times critics pick and has received Best in Show honors at numerous film festivals. So I've been very happy with the way that critics have perceived it. I guess I'm a little disappointed with the overall popularity of it, because I wasn't able to get the film into a major platform like Netflix, where everyone would have seen it. You can rent it on Amazon or iTunes or buy it on DVD like pretty much any other film. But most people that I tell about my film, they say, I think I remember hearing about it, but they don't know where they could have seen it or what channel it was on. So I guess I just wish I could have found a more high-profile platform for it to show. For example, when it played in theaters, it played for a couple of months in 10 or 11 cities, but it didn't have like a massive national release in hundreds of theaters the way some bigger films do. And then financially it costs some money to make, and I haven't made that much back. So that's also been a struggle. But all things considered, it is definitely a fairly successful film, and I know this because I'm have been in the documentary world for a bit of time now, and a lot of my peers make films that I think are just as good, but they don't really go anywhere and they don't make any money at all. So relative to a lot of my peers, I actually feel like I've done pretty well, and I'm very happy with the way the film has turned out. And after, like you said, the film was initially released in 2016. It still is playing at film festivals, but it's definitely, does not have the same buzz it had a few years ago. But the new development for me in the film is that Darius himself finally saw the film just a few weeks ago.
Oh.
Years after it came out.
Right.
And that's been so difficult because, like, strangers all over the world have, sent me messages and emails of how much they like the film, and yet the very person that the film is about, who stars in the film, hasn't been able to see it because he's been in jail this whole time, and they won't let him watch it. So finally, he got to see it, and he called me, and he said he gives it 4.5 stars out of 5, which I think is pretty good.
Okay.
And he said it was better than expected, which was actually a little bit insulting. And lastly, he said that I shouldn't call it my film, but I should call it our film. So Darius wants a lot more credit for having participated in the film. But I explained to him that, he's not the filmmaker. I did the filming, so it's still my film.
Right.
And he accepted that.
Okay. Is he the star of it?
Yeah, he's definitely the star.
Okay.
And he would love that title because he loves attention. He loves knowing that there's a movie about him out there, that thousands of people every day are watching this movie about him, and that his name is like in the history books.
Was there going to be or maybe they're already in production, a feature film about this particular case?
Yeah, that was some exciting news I got a couple years ago when I was finishing up filming Off the Rails. There was a Hollywood production company that got the rights to do a fictionalized film based on Darius's life, with actors, like a narrative film. And they were able to get to cast Julia Roberts to play Darius's attorney in the film. Okay. But I've recently learned that she's no longer on board, and the film, it still looks like it's happening, but sometimes these projects can literally take a decade to get off the ground. But from what I understand, it's been financed, and there's a script which I've read, which looks great, and they got to figure out who's going to play Darius. And I think also what they're working on is finding a happy ending. A lot of Hollywood movies generally need a happy ending to do well. Yeah. And Darius's story doesn't really have a happy ending because it's still going on.
Right.
And Darius is still essentially in jail. And, it's kind of hard to end a movie like that. So I think they're really trying to work on finding a way to have, at least in the film version, some kind of positive resolution to the story.
Hollywood wants a happy ending. So.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any film projects that you've got in the hopper that you're working on?
I do, but I have two that unfortunately I can't discuss either of them. But they're both pretty big projects that I will probably be working on for the next while. But they're also both uphill battles in trying to get the project sold because we're in a golden age for documentaries, which is great. But it also means that everyone and their goat is trying to make a documentary. So there's a lot of competition, and it's hard to get noticed in a very crowded media landscape. So that's about all I can say for now about that.
Well, then we'll be wishing you the best of luck. We think you did a great job with Off the Rails. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting movie, and anyone interested in true crime, like you said, or crime and mental illness and mental health treatment ought to check it out. Go ahead and find. I'll put your website up when we put up the podcast, and maybe people can check it out that way.
Yeah, great.
Okay, it's been a great discussion, and like I said, we wish you the best. perhaps you could tell Dariuss that the world's interested in his story.
Absolutely, I will, and thanks for having me.